The city of New York in the early 20th century was a place of stark contrasts, a sprawling urban jungle where wealth and poverty collided in a chaotic dance of ambition, crime, and survival. The skyline rose like jagged teeth, glass and steel towers glinting in the sunlight, but beneath this veneer of progress lay streets saturated with shadows. Narrow alleyways, overcrowded tenements, and bustling docks became breeding grounds for a type of power that could not be legislated or contained. Here, the rules of society were fragile, and those who understood the unspoken language of fear and loyalty could shape the city from behind the scenes. In this environment, every decision carried weight, every alliance could be life or death, and every betrayal left scars that stretched far beyond the immediate moment. Into this world came Charles Lucky Luciano, a man whose name would eventually become synonymous with both brilliance and brutality. He was not the first to navigate the streets, nor the strongest, but he possessed something more dangerous than muscle, a mind capable of seeing opportunity where others saw only chaos. Born into the immigrant neighborhoods of Lower East Side Manhattan, he was immersed from childhood in a society that demanded toughness, cunning, and a willingness to act without hesitation. The tenements were a crucible, burning away innocence and shaping a young boy into a predator, but also a strategist, someone who understood that power was rarely inherited, it was seized. His early experiences exposed him to the harsh reality that survival was intertwined with influence and control, and that in the shadows knowledge was as valuable as any weapon. The streets of New York pulsed with energy, danger, and unspoken hierarchies. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other immigrant gangs carved out territories, each vying for dominance, each enforcing their own codes with ruthless efficiency. Violence was a currency, respect a fragile commodity, and fear an ever-present companion. The police, underpaid and often corrupt, were as much a part of the system as the criminals they were meant to pursue. Bribery, intimidation, and alliances with law enforcement became tools of the trade, a reality that Luciano quickly understood. Yet even in this treacherous landscape he saw the possibility of something greater, a vision of order within disorder, a way to consolidate power not through chaos alone, but through organization, foresight, and calculated influence. What set Luciano apart was not merely his willingness to commit violence, though he did not shy away from it. It was his ability to read people, to anticipate moves, and to manipulate relationships in a world where loyalty was transient and betrayal often immediate. He observed the failures of older mobsters, men who ruled through brute force but were blind to strategy, and he noted every weakness, every inefficiency. He understood that in the underworld, survival required more than fear. It demanded trust carefully nurtured, alliances meticulously constructed, and enemies neutralized before they became threats. In this way Luciano began his ascent not as a brute, but as a tactician, someone who could see several moves ahead in a game whose stakes were life, empire, and legacy. The city itself became a character in his story, a living organism that both constrained and enabled him. The teeming streets, the cacophony of voices, the hum of factories, the rhythmic movement of ships on the East River, all of it created an ecosystem in which ambition could flourish if one understood its rules. Luciano's New York was not merely a backdrop, it was a canvas upon which he would sketch the outlines of an empire. And yet, the shadows were never far away. Behind the allure of power lurked the constant threat of violence, betrayal, and exposure. The same streets that could elevate a man could just as easily consume him. Luciano's genius lay in embracing this duality, in navigating the tension between light and darkness, between the public face of authority and the hidden machinery of control. By the time he began to step beyond mere street fights and small-scale thefts, the foundations of a different kind of criminal order were taking shape. He observed, learned, and adapted with relentless precision. Every interaction, every confrontation, every whispered warning from an ally or rival became part of a larger pattern, a mental map of the city's power structures and vulnerabilities. This was not merely instinct. It was strategy honed in an environment that rewarded cunning above all else. The city demanded both ruthlessness and intelligence, and Luciano's ascent was the result of his uncanny ability to balance these qualities. In introducing Lucky Luciano, one cannot ignore the magnetic tension between myth and reality, between the man he became and the world that shaped him. He would later be celebrated, vilified, and immortalized in equal measure, a figure whose life story reveals not only the mechanics of organized crime but also the psychological landscape of power, ambition, and human complexity. At the heart of it, his journey begins here, in the streets of a city that never sleeps, where shadows deepen the longer one watches, and where the promise of power comes with a price measured in blood, fear, and the fragile loyalty of men. The stage is set, the players are in motion, and the story of Lucky Luciano, the architect of an empire beneath the city, begins. Before Lucky Luciano would rise to dominate New York's criminal underworld, the city existed in a state of fragmented chaos, a tinderbox of ethnic rivalries, unbridled violence and unchecked ambition. The early decades of the 20th century saw waves of immigrants pouring into Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the surrounding boroughs, each group carving out enclaves where their traditions, languages, and survival instincts dictated every interaction. Italians crowded into the Lower East Side, the Irish controlled parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn, and Jewish gangs ran their own territories, all competing for scarce resources, influence, and a measure of respect on the streets. In this environment, the criminal world was as much a reflection of society as it was a distortion of it. Brutal, competitive, and unforgiving. Organized crime before Luciano was a patchwork of small-time operators and aging dons, men who relied on intimidation and tradition rather than strategy and structure. Figures like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano held sway over segments of the Italian-American underworld, but their methods were often brutal, short-sighted, and intensely personal. Territory was protected through violence, disputes resolved through murder rather than negotiation, and loyalty was enforced through fear rather than careful diplomacy. The gangs were fractured, the rules inconsistent, and the results were bloody skirmishes that left the streets littered with casualties but little lasting order. This instability created an atmosphere where power was temporary, alliances fragile, and survival required constant vigilance. For the immigrant communities themselves, this world was both a menace and a mirror. Many turned a blind eye to the criminal enterprises that brought money, jobs, and protection to their neighborhoods, even as fear lingered in the alleys and backrooms. Speakeasies, gambling dens, and illegal bars thrived, fueled by the Prohibition era's ban on alcohol, but they were also flashpoints for violence and corruption. Policemen could be bribed, judges intimidated, and political figures manipulated, yet no single figure had emerged capable of uniting these disparate elements into a cohesive force. The streets were ruled by chaos, and the chaos demanded a new kind of leadership. Into this fractured landscape, Luciano would later insert himself not merely as a participant but as an architect of a new order. But before he could reshape the underworld, it was essential to understand the raw, untamed world he inherited. The chaos of pre-Luciano New York created both opportunity and danger. Young men with ambition could rise, but many were destroyed by the same environment that offered them their first taste of power. Violence was not an exception, it was the norm. Betrayal was ever present, often hidden behind smiles or handshakes, a constant reminder that trust was fleeting. In these conditions, survival required not just courage but calculation, and few men possessed the combination of intellect, charisma, and ruthlessness necessary to thrive. The criminal hierarchy before Luciano was rigid in its traditions but weak in execution. Leadership was often determined by birthright, old connections, or sheer force of will, leaving the system vulnerable to those who could see its flaws. Masuria, for example, wielded influence through intimidation and loyalty enforced by fear, yet he was blind to the potential of organization, innovation, and strategic alliances. Maranzano, later a rival, sought to impose a Sicilian-style hierarchy, emphasizing titles, ritual, and loyalty to the old ways. Both approaches lacked flexibility and adaptability, traits that would become Luciano's greatest weapons. Where others saw chaos, he saw a blueprint, a way to turn disorder into empire. The streets themselves told stories of missed opportunity and fleeting power. Corner gangs controlled neighborhoods for weeks before rivals moved in. Small-time rackets thrived for a moment before being crushed by superior force. Prohibition had created a gold rush for illicit liquor, but the rewards were claimed in fits and starts, with little overarching structure or strategic planning. Violence was episodic but intense, leaving communities traumatized and law enforcement perpetually one step behind. In this environment, a visionary mind like Luciano's could observe, learn, and calculate on a scale far beyond the capacity of any single gang boss. Yet it was not just the chaos of violence that defined the pre-Luciano underworld. It was also the psychology of fear, ambition, and survival that permeated every interaction. Men and women learned early that opportunities were fleeting, that allies could become enemies in a heartbeat, and that power was both alluring and deadly. In neighborhoods filled with the scent of sweat, smoke, and uncertainty, young men like Luciano internalized these lessons, turning observation into strategy, intuition into planning, and instinct into dominance. The world of crime was not merely a game of force. It was a psychological battlefield where perception, influence, and foresight could determine life or death. Understanding this chaotic, fragmented New York is essential to comprehending Luciano's later rise. The city before him was a reflection of human ambition in its rawest form. Messy, violent, and unpredictable, yet filled with opportunity for those capable of seeing beyond immediate gain. Inheriting this fractured empire, Luciano would not simply participate in it. He would transform it. He would impose order upon disorder, build networks that could withstand betrayal, and introduce a system of influence that balanced fear, loyalty, and profit. The New York he inherited was wild, dangerous, and chaotic, the perfect proving ground for a man who would come to be known not merely as a gangster, but as a strategist, an innovator, and, ultimately, the architect of a criminal empire. Lucky Luciano's story begins not in the boardrooms of power or the backrooms of speakeasies, but in the crowded, narrow streets of Lower East Side Manhattan, where the smell of coal smoke mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread, and where life was as unforgiving as it was vibrant. Born as Salvatore Lucania in 1897 to Sicilian immigrants, he entered a world defined by struggle, scarcity, and a relentless drive for survival. His parents, like many immigrants, sought to escape poverty and forge a better life in America, but the streets offered lessons that school could not teach. The environment demanded toughness, awareness, and an understanding that life's rewards were often claimed through cunning rather than lawfulness. From a young age, Luciano was immersed in the contradictions of his surroundings. Warmth and community within his immigrant enclave, juxtaposed with constant threats from rival groups, law enforcement, and the harsh realities of urban life. The tenements of the Lower East Side were both a home and a crucible. Children played in alleyways while gangs prowled the streets, and adults juggled menial jobs with the constant fear of eviction, illness, or violence. For a boy like Luciano, survival required acute observation. He quickly learned to read people, to understand motivations, and to recognize weakness, skills that would later define his rise. Early encounters with street fights, petty thefts, and rival children from neighboring blocks were not merely childhood scrapes. They were miniature battles, early lessons in strategy, loyalty, and reputation. Each scuffle, each negotiation over stolen fruit or corner territory, became part of a psychological training ground, sharpening his instincts for the larger battles that lay ahead. Education, though limited, offered glimpses of a different kind of intelligence. Luciano was described as sharp, quick to learn, and unusually perceptive. But the streets exerted a stronger influence than any classroom. While other boys may have dreamed of legitimate professions, Luciano's aspirations were shaped by the tangible rewards of influence, respect, fear, and the ability to bend circumstances to one's advantage. He understood early that authority in his neighborhood was earned through both action and perception, and that reputation could protect or endanger a young man in equal measure. This understanding of human psychology, the subtle dance between fear, loyalty, and ambition, would become the cornerstone of his later strategy as a mob boss. Family ties played a complicated role in his development. The Lucania household was loving but constrained by the hardships of immigrant life. The cultural emphasis on honor, obedience, and survival created a moral framework that Luciano would both adopt and manipulate. The Sicilian concepts of loyalty and respect, alongside an acceptance of morally gray decisions in the pursuit of survival, provided fertile ground for his emerging worldview. These early lessons would later allow him to navigate the ethical ambiguities of organized crime with a confidence that others lacked, understanding when to enforce rules and when to bend them for strategic gain. By his teenage years, Luciano had begun to gravitate toward the street gangs that dominated his neighborhood. These were not random acts of delinquency, they were carefully calculated moves, opportunities to learn the rules of power firsthand. He joined minor criminal crews, earning a reputation for both daring and intelligence. Unlike many of his peers, he did not rely solely on brute force. Instead, he combined charm, cunning, and strategic thinking to build influence. Small victories in fights, successful thefts, or well-timed interventions in gang disputes earned him respect, and respect in this world was currency. Each encounter reinforced his understanding that power was not static but relational, dependent on perception, alliances, and timing. These formative years also introduced him to mentorship and key relationships that would later shape the trajectory of his life. Older gang members, experienced in both violence and negotiation, recognized in Luciano a rare combination of ambition and intellect. They provided guidance, instruction, and opportunities for him to test his skills in more serious criminal ventures. At the same time, he observed the mistakes of others: over-reliance on fear, impulsive violence, and mismanagement of alliances, lessons that he would internalize as warnings. By analyzing both the successes and failures of those around him, he began to craft a personal philosophy of leadership that combined pragmatism with calculated risk. The psychological evolution of Luciano during these years cannot be overstated. He developed a keen sense of timing, understanding when to act and when to wait, when to assert dominance and when to defer. He learned that loyalty could be both weapon and shield, that influence was more sustainable than brute force, and that perception could be manipulated as effectively as reality. Even in adolescence, he exhibited traits that would later define the archetype of the modern gangster: ruthlessness tempered by strategic patience, a talent for negotiation, and an unerring sense of opportunity. He understood that the streets of New York were a microcosm of human behavior itself, a chaotic, dangerous world that rewarded intelligence, adaptability, and audacity. By the time Luciano transitioned from adolescence into young adulthood, he was no longer merely a participant in street-level crime. He had absorbed its lessons, honed its strategies, and begun to envision a path beyond petty theft and local skirmishes. He understood that power on a larger scale required alliances beyond neighborhood gangs, a network that spanned boroughs, ethnicities, and criminal enterprises. The ambitions that would later define his rise were seeded in these formative years, nurtured by observation, hardened by experience, and sharpened by the constant pressures of survival in one of the most dangerous and dynamic environments imaginable. In essence, Luciano's early life was a masterclass in adaptation and ambition. From the cramped tenements to the bustling streets of the Lower East Side, every encounter, every struggle, and every small victory contributed to the psychological blueprint of a man who would one day redefine organized crime. The boy who once fought for scraps in alleys would evolve into the strategist who orchestrated empires, negotiated alliances, and wielded fear and loyalty with equal skill. His rise was inevitable not because of innate violence, but because of a rare combination of intelligence, observation, and the relentless drive to survive, traits forged in the unforgiving crucible of New York itself. By the time Lucky Luciano reached his late teens, the streets of New York were no longer just a classroom, they had become his proving ground. He had survived the chaos of the Lower East Side, learned the language of survival, and developed a keen sense for strategy and human behavior. But to rise in this world, observation alone was not enough. Power demanded action, initiative, and the ability to assert influence where others faltered. This was the point at which Luciano began to transition from street-smart boy to active participant in organized crime, taking his first deliberate steps toward building a reputation that would eventually redefine the underworld. Luciano's initiation into gangs was not ceremonial in the romanticized sense. There were no formal oaths, no secret rituals, only a continuous series of tests, challenges, and opportunities to prove worth. For a young man, each act of defiance, each display of cunning, and each demonstration of courage functioned as a public audition. Luciano quickly learned that respect was earned, not demanded, and that small victories could accumulate into a reputation far more powerful than mere physical strength. Early on, he became known for his ability to navigate disputes with both tact and force, a combination that set him apart from peers who relied solely on violence or intimidation. The minor crews and street gangs he joined provided both mentorship and practical experience. Older, more experienced criminals recognized his intelligence and ambition, allowing him to participate in increasingly consequential operations. These were not high-profile heists or grand schemes, but smaller acts, protection rackets, petty theft, and enforcement, that tested his judgment, resilience, and capacity for leadership. Each task presented a delicate balance. Act too aggressively and he risked alienating allies, act too passively and he would be seen as weak. Luciano learned to read situations with precision, assessing when to assert dominance, when to negotiate, and when to bide his time, refining the instincts that would later serve him in the complex power plays of the mafia. What distinguished Luciano from other young gangsters was his strategic mind. While many were satisfied with the immediate rewards of street-level crime, he understood the value of building influence, cultivating alliances, and leveraging information. He observed the hierarchy of the gangs, noting who commanded respect, who was vulnerable, and how loyalty shifted depending on circumstance. This awareness allowed him to act with foresight, aligning himself with mentors, benefactors, and partners who could enhance his rise. He was not simply surviving. He was positioning himself, laying the foundations for a network that would eventually extend far beyond the alleys of his youth. Violence remained a constant undercurrent, but Luciano approached it with calculation rather than impulse. He recognized that every act of aggression carried consequences: potential retaliation, legal exposure, or the erosion of valuable alliances. Even as he participated in fights and enforced the rules of the streets, he learned to temper force with diplomacy, to manipulate situations so that power was exerted with maximum effect and minimal risk. In this way he began to internalize a philosophy that would define his career, that true control over the underworld came not just from fear, but from the careful orchestration of influence, perception, and loyalty. The streets also provided lessons in psychology. Luciano studied human behavior in real time, the way fear could motivate obedience, how respect could command loyalty, and how subtle manipulation could turn potential enemies into allies. He learned that reputation was a living currency, fluctuating with every decision, and that perception often mattered more than reality. This understanding allowed him to navigate rivalries, manage disputes, and exploit opportunities with a sophistication that set him apart from his contemporaries. Where others relied on brute force alone, Luciano combined intellect, timing, and social acumen, transforming everyday survival into a strategic game of power. It was during this period that he began forging the alliances that would define his rise. Notably, his connection with Meyer Lansky, a fellow young criminal with a sharp mind for finance and organization, marked the beginning of partnerships that would extend across the underworld. Together, they explored ventures that blended entrepreneurship with illicit activity, learning how to balance risk, reward, and secrecy. These relationships demonstrated Luciano's ability to identify talent, cultivate trust, and leverage complementary skills, traits essential for anyone seeking to command a criminal empire in a city as complex and fragmented as New York. By the early 1920s, Luciano had transformed from a street-smart teenager into a formidable young gangster, recognized not merely for his toughness but for his cunning, ambition, and emerging leadership. He was no longer just reacting to the chaotic world around him. He was beginning to shape it, exercising influence, managing loyalty, and orchestrating small-scale operations that hinted at the larger empire he would eventually construct. The seeds of innovation were evident. He saw the potential to organize criminal activity with discipline and efficiency, to systematize the chaos that had defined New York's underworld for decades, and to create networks that would endure even amidst violence and betrayal. This period of initiation also hardened him psychologically. The lessons of betrayal, the consequences of failure, and the constant exposure to risk forged a mindset capable of long-term planning, ethical flexibility, and emotional detachment when necessary. Luciano was learning that survival in the criminal world required more than courage. It demanded foresight, patience, and a willingness to act decisively in morally ambiguous situations. Each small success reinforced the principle that control over people and events was more valuable than immediate gratification, and that influence could extend far beyond the reach of the strongest fist or the sharpest knife. By the end of this formative stage, Luciano had established a reputation that carried weight in both the streets and the emerging circles of organized crime. He had transitioned from observer to actor, from student to strategist, and from a local street fighter to a figure whose ambitions could no longer be contained by neighborhood boundaries. The groundwork was laid for the next phase of his rise, the transformation from a skilled street operator into a visionary architect of a criminal empire, a man capable of uniting fractured gangs, reshaping the underworld, and building an enduring legacy in a city defined by shadows. By the early 1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved beyond the chaotic streets of his youth. The battles for territory, respect, and survival had taught him invaluable lessons, but the true test of his ambition lay in building relationships that could amplify his influence. In the fragmented underworld of New York, raw talent and courage were insufficient. Success depended on the ability to forge alliances that transcended neighborhood rivalries, ethnic boundaries, and personal grudges. Luciano understood this intuitively. He knew that strength alone could not secure power. Intelligence, trust, and strategic vision were equally vital. And so, he began to cultivate partnerships that would define the trajectory of his rise. Among his earliest and most consequential alliances was the one he formed with Meyer Lansky, a fellow young criminal with an exceptional mind for organization and finance. Lansky was not a man of violence by nature, but he possessed an uncanny ability to structure operations, manage risk, and navigate the subtleties of human behavior. Together, the two forged a partnership that blended Luciano's tactical ruthlessness with Lansky's strategic ingenuity. Their collaboration marked a turning point. Luciano was no longer acting alone in small-scale street operations. He was learning how to leverage networks, delegate authority, and maximize returns on both money and influence. The psychological chemistry between them was remarkable. Luciano understood instinctively how to inspire loyalty, while Lansky thrived on structure and foresight. The result was a synergy that would propel them into the upper echelons of organized crime. Luciano's ability to forge alliances extended beyond personal friendship. He had a keen eye for talent, recognizing the potential in individuals others might dismiss. He understood that a criminal enterprise was not built solely on fear or brute strength. It required specialists, strategists, and loyal lieutenants. By surrounding himself with capable men, those who shared his vision, respected his authority, and could execute his plans, he created a network that was both resilient and adaptable. Each relationship was carefully calibrated, balancing loyalty with opportunity, fear with respect, and reward with consequence. Through these early alliances, Luciano began to construct the blueprint for the empire he would later formalize, a system in which influence was multiplied through collaboration rather than isolated dominance. Rivalries, however, were inevitable. The Italian-American underworld was deeply fragmented, ruled by men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who commanded loyalty through fear and tradition rather than innovation. Luciano navigated these dangerous waters with remarkable foresight, learning to balance deference with ambition. He understood the importance of timing, recognizing when to show respect, when to negotiate, and when to assert his own authority. These alliances were as much about survival as they were about expansion. Each handshake, each deal, and each shared operation was a test, a subtle negotiation of trust, and a demonstration of his emerging acumen for power dynamics. The strategic nature of these partnerships also revealed Luciano's understanding of psychology in the underworld. He studied motivations, observed reactions, and anticipated moves before they occurred. He recognized that influence was rarely secured through force alone. Perception often mattered as much as action. By projecting confidence, competence, and calculated ruthlessness, he commanded respect even from those who might have once seen him as a subordinate. This ability to read people, combined with a meticulous understanding of human incentives, allowed him to navigate the treacherous interplay of loyalty and betrayal that defined organized crime. Another critical element of Luciano's alliance building was his ability to bridge ethnic and cultural divides within the criminal world. While many gangs were insular, focusing exclusively on their own communities, Luciano saw opportunity in cooperation. Jewish, Italian, and even Irish criminal enterprises could coexist, provided the arrangements were mutually beneficial. His relationships with figures like Lansky and Bugsy Siegel exemplified this approach. They transcended ethnic boundaries and focused on practical outcomes. Luciano's insight was revolutionary for the time. He realized that the city's fractured underworld could be unified not by eliminating rival factions, but by creating interdependent networks that increased profits and stability for all participants. Yet these alliances were never without tension. Trust in this world was fragile, loyalty conditional, and betrayal a constant threat. Luciano had to navigate a delicate balance, reward those who were loyal, discipline those who wavered, and neutralize those who posed a serious threat. Every action carried both strategic and psychological weight. By managing these relationships with precision, he strengthened his position while simultaneously weakening potential rivals. The process required patience, calculation, and a deep understanding of human nature, a combination that would become his hallmark in the years to come. It was during this phase that Luciano also began to appreciate the importance of reputation. In a world where rumors traveled faster than news and word of a betrayal could destroy a man overnight, perception was a powerful tool. By demonstrating both generosity and ruthlessness in calculated doses, he crafted an image that inspired respect, fear, and loyalty simultaneously. Allies were reassured by his fairness and competence, while potential rivals were deterred by his unpredictability and decisiveness. The psychological interplay of these dynamics allowed him to consolidate power far more efficiently than brute force alone could achieve. Through these alliances and early partnerships, Luciano began to see the contours of a new kind of underworld, one governed by strategy, organization, and calculated influence rather than raw chaos. He was not content to operate as a subordinate within existing hierarchies. Instead, he envisioned a network that could coordinate activity across boroughs, ethnic lines, and criminal enterprises, creating stability, efficiency, and immense profitability. The seeds of the modern mafia, with its sophisticated hierarchy, division of labor, and system of loyalty and fear, were being sown during this critical period. By the end of this stage, Luciano had transformed from a talented street operator into a strategist capable of thinking in systems rather than individual skirmishes. His alliances had provided him with both protection and leverage, allowing him to operate with increasing confidence and autonomy. The underworld was no longer merely a chaotic battlefield. It was a landscape he could map, manipulate, and eventually dominate. The foundations of his empire were being laid, built not on brute force alone, but on intelligence, observation, and the careful cultivation of relationships that would become the pillars of his enduring power. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved beyond alliances and small-scale operations. He had begun to see the underworld not as a collection of chaotic gangs, but as a vast, interconnected enterprise waiting to be organized. The city's criminal landscape was fragmented and volatile, with loyalties shifting like sand and rivalries erupting in bloodshed at the slightest provocation. For most, this chaos was a permanent condition, something to endure rather than control. But Luciano had a different vision. He imagined a network that could impose order upon disorder, a system in which power, profit, and influence were coordinated and optimized rather than left to chance. This was not merely ambition, it was strategic foresight, a blueprint for the empire he intended to construct. At the heart of this vision was the idea that organized crime could function much like a legitimate business, with divisions of labor, hierarchies, and systems of accountability. Luciano understood that the traditional mafia model, based largely on fear, ritual, and rigid adherence to Sicilian traditions, was inefficient and vulnerable. Older bosses relied on brute force to enforce loyalty, often at the expense of long-term stability. Luciano, by contrast, sought to replace unpredictability with structure, violence with calculated enforcement, and ad hoc alliances with networks that could endure beyond individual egos. The psychological genius of this approach lay in its subtlety. By creating a sense of order and reliability, he could command loyalty without relying solely on fear, while maintaining the flexibility to neutralize threats before they became crises. Luciano's restructuring began with the families themselves. The mafia had long operated in isolated factions, each controlling its own territory and operations independently. Rivalries were constant, and disputes were often resolved through bloodshed rather than negotiation. Luciano envisioned a hierarchy that would unite these factions while respecting their autonomy. He introduced the concept of commissions, advisory councils where representatives of different families could resolve conflicts, coordinate operations, and enforce collective decisions. This innovation transformed the underworld from a series of disconnected fiefdoms into a networked system capable of coordinated action, mitigating internal warfare while amplifying profits. Equally revolutionary was Luciano's approach to alliances. He extended partnerships across ethnic and criminal lines, integrating Jewish, Italian, and even Irish operators into a cohesive network. This was more than pragmatism, it was psychological mastery. By demonstrating that cooperation could yield greater wealth and stability than conflict, he shifted the incentives that had long governed the streets. Allies became partners, competitors became collaborators, and the traditional rules of engagement were replaced with a more sophisticated calculus of mutual benefit. Luciano's empire was as much about influence and perception as it was about brute force, and his ability to orchestrate these alliances marked him as a strategist unparalleled among his contemporaries. The operational side of his empire reflected this same combination of innovation and calculation. Luciano transformed gambling, bootlegging, union control, and other illicit enterprises into highly organized ventures. He applied business principles to crime. Profits were tracked, operations were monitored, and risks were calculated. Subordinates were held accountable, and enforcement was applied strategically rather than randomly. By creating systems that mirrored legitimate corporate practices, Luciano could expand his reach, stabilize revenue streams, and reduce internal conflict. The underworld became a disciplined network rather than a collection of volatile gangs, and the psychological impact was profound. Men who once fought for scraps of territory now operated under a clear, predictable hierarchy, knowing that loyalty and competence were rewarded, while disloyalty carried consequences. One of Luciano's most remarkable traits was his ability to combine ruthlessness with vision. Violence was always a tool, but it was wielded with precision. When a threat emerged, it was neutralized efficiently, often without the dramatic displays that had characterized earlier gang wars. By controlling the timing, method, and messaging of enforcement, he reinforced authority without creating chaos, projecting power while maintaining stability. This approach relied on a deep understanding of human behavior, anticipating reactions, manipulating fear, and cultivating loyalty simultaneously. The result was an empire in which obedience was earned, not demanded, and where influence extended far beyond the reach of any single gun or knife. Luciano's psychological acuity was equally evident in his management of internal dynamics. He understood that leadership in the underworld required both reward and discipline, charisma and calculation. Subordinates needed to see that loyalty was profitable, that competence mattered, and that betrayal was unacceptable. By carefully balancing incentives and consequences, he created an organizational culture that emphasized both obedience and initiative. Men were empowered to act on his behalf, but always within the framework he established. This balance of control and autonomy was unprecedented, and it laid the foundation for a criminal empire that could endure even in the face of law enforcement pressure and intergang rivalries. The formalization of his network also allowed Luciano to expand geographically and operationally. Territories that had once been fiercely contested became coordinated zones, with operations managed to maximize efficiency and minimize conflict. Bootlegging during Prohibition provided the perfect vehicle for expansion, generating immense profits that were reinvested into further enterprises. Luciano's ability to integrate diverse operations, illegal gambling, narcotics, prostitution, labor racketeering, into a coherent system was revolutionary. Each enterprise reinforced the others, creating a web of interdependence that increased both profitability and resilience. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's innovations reshaped the psychology of the underworld itself. Fear remained a tool, but it was tempered by predictability, stability, and opportunity. Men who once acted impulsively now understood that success required cooperation, strategy, and foresight. Loyalty was cultivated, not coerced, and ambition could be channeled within the framework of a larger system. This transformation of both structure and mindset distinguished Luciano from his predecessors. He was not merely a gangster. He was a visionary, capable of designing and implementing systems of power that combined efficiency, psychology, and ruthlessness in equal measure. By the late 1920s, Luciano's empire had begun to take shape. The streets of New York were no longer just chaotic battlegrounds. They had become a networked system under his influence, where alliances were strategic, operations coordinated, and power projected with precision. He had transformed the fragmented underworld into a disciplined, hierarchical, and highly profitable enterprise. What had begun as a vision nurtured in the alleyways of his youth had evolved into an empire built on strategy, psychology, and relentless innovation. The foundations were laid for what would become the modern American mafia, a legacy defined not only by violence but by the genius of organization and foresight. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved beyond alliances and small-scale operations. He had begun to see the underworld not as a collection of chaotic gangs, but as a vast, interconnected enterprise waiting to be organized. The city's criminal landscape was fragmented and volatile, with loyalties shifting like sand and rivalries erupting in bloodshed at the slightest provocation. For most, this chaos was a permanent condition, something to endure rather than control. But Luciano had a different vision. He imagined a network that could impose order upon disorder, a system in which power, profit, and influence were coordinated and optimized rather than left to chance. This was not merely ambition, it was strategic foresight, a blueprint for the empire he intended to construct. At the heart of this vision was the idea that organized crime could function much like a legitimate business, with divisions of labor, hierarchies, and systems of accountability. Luciano understood that the traditional mafia model, based largely on fear, ritual, and rigid adherence to Sicilian traditions, was inefficient and vulnerable. Older bosses relied on brute force to enforce loyalty, often at the expense of long-term stability. Luciano, by contrast, sought to replace unpredictability with structure, violence with calculated enforcement, and ad hoc alliances with networks that could endure beyond individual egos. The psychological genius of this approach lay in its subtlety. By creating a sense of order and reliability, he could command loyalty without relying solely on fear, while maintaining the flexibility to neutralize threats before they became crises. Luciano's restructuring began with the families themselves. The mafia had long operated in isolated factions, each controlling its own territory and operations independently. Rivalries were constant, and disputes were often resolved through bloodshed rather than negotiation. Luciano envisioned a hierarchy that would unite these factions while respecting their autonomy. He introduced the concept of commissions, advisory councils where representatives of different families could resolve conflicts, coordinate operations, and enforce collective decisions. This innovation transformed the underworld from a series of disconnected fiefdoms into a networked system capable of coordinated action, mitigating internal warfare while amplifying profits. Equally revolutionary was Luciano's approach to alliances. He extended partnerships across ethnic and criminal lines, integrating Jewish, Italian, and even Irish operators into a cohesive network. This was more than pragmatism, it was psychological mastery. By demonstrating that cooperation could yield greater wealth and stability than conflict, he shifted the incentives that had long governed the streets. Allies became partners, competitors became collaborators, and the traditional rules of engagement were replaced with a more sophisticated calculus of mutual benefit. Luciano's empire was as much about influence and perception as it was about brute force, and his ability to orchestrate these alliances marked him as a strategist unparalleled among his contemporaries. The operational side of his empire reflected this same combination of innovation and calculation. Luciano transformed gambling, bootlegging, union control, and other illicit enterprises into highly organized ventures. He applied business principles to crime. Profits were tracked, operations were monitored, and risks were calculated. Subordinates were held accountable, and enforcement was applied strategically rather than randomly. By creating systems that mirrored legitimate corporate practices, Luciano could expand his reach, stabilize revenue streams, and reduce internal conflict. The underworld became a disciplined network rather than a collection of volatile gangs, and the psychological impact was profound. Men who once fought for scraps of territory now operated under a clear, predictable hierarchy, knowing that loyalty and competence were rewarded, while disloyalty carried consequences. One of Luciano's most remarkable traits was his ability to combine ruthlessness with vision. Violence was always a tool, but it was wielded with precision. When a threat emerged, it was neutralized efficiently, often without the dramatic displays that had characterized earlier gang wars. By controlling the timing, method, and messaging of enforcement, he reinforced authority without creating chaos, projecting power while maintaining stability. This approach relied on a deep understanding of human behavior, anticipating reactions, manipulating fear, and cultivating loyalty simultaneously. The result was an empire in which obedience was earned, not demanded, and where influence extended far beyond the reach of any single gun or knife. Luciano's psychological acuity was equally evident in his management of internal dynamics. He understood that leadership in the underworld required both reward and discipline, charisma and calculation. Subordinates needed to see that loyalty was profitable, that competence mattered, and that betrayal was unacceptable. By carefully balancing incentives and consequences, he created an organizational culture that emphasized both obedience and initiative. Men were empowered to act on his behalf, but always within the framework he established. This balance of control and autonomy was unprecedented, and it laid the foundation for a criminal empire that could endure even in the face of law enforcement pressure and intergang rivalries. The formalization of his network also allowed Luciano to expand geographically and operationally. Territories that had once been fiercely contested became coordinated zones, with operations managed to maximize efficiency and minimize conflict. Bootlegging during Prohibition provided the perfect vehicle for expansion, generating immense profits that were reinvested into further enterprises. Luciano's ability to integrate diverse operations, illegal gambling, narcotics, prostitution, labor racketeering, into a coherent system was revolutionary. Each enterprise reinforced the others, creating a web of interdependence that increased both profitability and resilience. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's innovations reshaped the psychology of the underworld itself. Fear remained a tool, but it was tempered by predictability, stability, and opportunity. Men who once acted impulsively now understood that success required cooperation, strategy, and foresight. Loyalty was cultivated, not coerced, and ambition could be channeled within the framework of a larger system. This transformation of both structure and mindset distinguished Luciano from his predecessors. He was not merely a gangster. He was a visionary, capable of designing and implementing systems of power that combined efficiency, psychology, and ruthlessness in equal measure. By the late 1920s, Luciano's empire had begun to take shape. The streets of New York were no longer just chaotic battlegrounds. They had become a networked system under his influence, where alliances were strategic, operations coordinated, and power projected with precision. He had transformed the fragmented underworld into a disciplined, hierarchical, and highly profitable enterprise. What had begun as a vision nurtured in the alleyways of his youth had evolved into an empire built on strategy, psychology, and relentless innovation. The foundations were laid for what would become the modern American mafia, a legacy defined not only by violence but by the genius of organization and foresight. By the time Lucky Luciano had solidified his alliances and mastered the psychological power of omerta, he was ready to transform the underworld into a sophisticated and highly profitable enterprise. The streets of New York had provided him with the lessons of survival, loyalty, and violence, But the real genius of his rise lay in his ability to systematize crime, turning chaos into a business. To Luciano, crime was more than a series of opportunistic acts. It was a network of enterprises that could be coordinated, optimized, and expanded with precision. He approached his operations with the eye of a strategist, understanding that influence, money, and control were deeply interconnected, and that the empire he envisioned required both ruthlessness and intelligence. One of Luciano's earliest and most lucrative ventures was gambling, which he transformed from disorganized street games into a multi-layered, efficient system. Illegal casinos, betting parlors, and numbers rackets were no longer mere local operations. They became coordinated businesses with defined territories, management hierarchies, and revenue streams that were meticulously monitored. Each operation was carefully structured to minimize risk, maximize profit, and maintain secrecy. Luciano employed trusted lieutenants to oversee day-to-day activity, ensuring that the organization's rules were followed and that disputes were resolved internally rather than escalating into open conflict. Through this approach, he elevated gambling from a chaotic pastime into a disciplined and highly profitable operation, demonstrating the power of organization over mere intimidation. Prohibition presented Luciano with an unprecedented opportunity to expand his empire. The ban on alcohol created enormous demand, and where there is demand, opportunity, and danger follows. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to exploit this environment with strategic foresight. He orchestrated the production, importation, and distribution of liquor on a massive scale, coordinating shipments from various sources and ensuring smooth delivery to speakeasies, clubs, and private clients across the city. By controlling the supply chain, he could dictate terms, manage risk, and outmaneuver competitors who relied on ad hoc operations. The profits from bootlegging were staggering, providing the capital necessary to expand other ventures and solidify alliances. Every transaction, every shipment, every negotiation was calculated to reinforce his authority, build loyalty, and maximize financial gain. Labor racketeering was another cornerstone of Luciano's empire, and perhaps one of his most psychologically sophisticated operations. By infiltrating unions and controlling access to jobs, he exerted influence over entire industries from construction to shipping. Workers and union leaders alike were compelled to comply, either through incentives or intimidation, creating a subtle yet pervasive system of control. Luciano understood the human element at play. Fear could enforce obedience, but incentive ensured cooperation. By balancing these forces, he transformed labor unions into both profit centers and instruments of power, further extending his influence into areas that had previously been inaccessible to organized crime. Luciano's approach to these criminal enterprises was systematic and methodical. He understood that efficiency required both delegation and oversight. Lieutenants managed operations on the ground, while he maintained strategic control over the network. Financial records were carefully monitored, and intelligence on rival operations was constantly updated. Violence was employed strategically, not indiscriminately, ensuring that the empire expanded without destabilizing itself. This combination of business acumen and psychological insight allowed Luciano to operate on a scale unmatched by his contemporaries. The empire was not just a collection of illicit activities, it was an integrated system in which each part reinforced the others, creating a network that was resilient, profitable, and adaptable. One of the hallmarks of Luciano's operations was his ability to integrate diverse ventures into a cohesive whole. Gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and even extortion were not isolated activities. They were interdependent components of a larger strategy. Profits from one enterprise were reinvested into another, creating a cycle of growth and influence. Key personnel were rotated and cross-trained across operations, ensuring that expertise was distributed and the organization could withstand disruptions. By thinking in terms of systems rather than individual ventures, Luciano created an empire that functioned with remarkable efficiency, a criminal machine that was as psychologically sophisticated as it was financially powerful. The psychological dimension of Luciano's business strategy was as important as its financial or operational components. He understood that men responded to perception, reward, and fear in nuanced ways. Lieutenants who excelled were promoted, given access to more profitable ventures, and publicly recognized for their achievements. Those who faltered were disciplined swiftly, demonstrating the consequences of failure. Rivals were monitored and neutralized strategically, often before they realized the threat. By manipulating incentives and consequences, Luciano maintained control over a sprawling network without the need for constant personal intervention, demonstrating a level of psychological mastery rare in the violent world he inhabited. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's approach to organized crime represented a paradigm shift. Where previous generations of mobsters had relied on intimidation, tradition, or brute force alone, he combined structure, strategy, and psychology to build a resilient and adaptive empire. Violence remained a tool, but it was used with precision. Loyalty was enforced, but it was also earned. Profit was maximized, but risk was carefully managed. In doing so, he elevated the underworld from a series of fragmented gangs into a disciplined, highly efficient network that operated like a shadow economy beneath the city's surface. By the late 1920s, Luciano's empire had grown to encompass an unprecedented range of operations, from gambling dens in Manhattan to bootlegging networks spanning the East Coast, from union infiltration to organized extortion. Each enterprise reinforced the others, creating both financial power and political influence. Luciano had not merely survived the chaotic streets of New York, he had transformed them into a structured and profitable network, demonstrating that crime, when organized with intelligence and foresight, could rival legitimate enterprise in both scope and efficiency. The city itself had become a stage for his vision, and every operation, alliance, and calculated move contributed to the psychological and operational dominance that would define his reign. In essence, the business of crime under Luciano was not random or opportunistic. It was systematic, strategic, and psychologically astute. He had created a network that rewarded loyalty, enforced discipline, and maximized profit, all while projecting an aura of control and inevitability. His operations were more than criminal ventures. They were lessons in human behavior, leadership, and strategy, demonstrating that the empire he had envisioned was not only possible but unstoppable. The foundation for the modern mafia was being solidified, and the streets of New York had become a laboratory in which Luciano perfected the science of organized crime, blending business, psychology, and power into a machine capable of unparalleled influence. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had grown into a sprawling network of gambling, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and illicit enterprises that extended across New York City and beyond. But power, no matter how strategically accumulated, inevitably attracts rivals, sparks envy, and provokes betrayal. The underworld was a volatile theater of ambition, where every alliance could shift overnight and every handshake concealed a knife. Luciano, despite his brilliance, was not immune to these dynamics. He faced a landscape where allies could become enemies, loyalty was constantly tested, and survival required both foresight and decisive action. This was the crucible in which the next phase of his rise, and the fragility of even the most meticulously constructed empire, would be revealed. The first and most pressing challenge came from established figures in the Italian-American mafia, men who had ruled through fear, tradition, and brute force long before Luciano envisioned a structured network. Joe Masuria, a dominant presence in New York, epitomized the old guard, ruthless, stubborn, and deeply committed to maintaining power through intimidation. To the older bosses, Luciano's innovations, his alliances with Jewish gangsters, his coordination across families, his emphasis on organization over sheer violence, were a threat. They feared that his methods would destabilize the hierarchy they had maintained for decades. Luciano understood this tension perfectly. He knew that to survive and expand, he would have to navigate not only external threats from rival gangs but also internal opposition from the very men whose traditions he was subtly redefining. Allies, too, became part of this complex equation. The relationships Luciano had cultivated, carefully balanced between loyalty, respect, and mutual gain, were constantly under pressure. Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and other partners provided both strategic advantage and potential complications. While these men shared his vision, each had their own ambitions, egos, and risk tolerance. Maintaining unity among such a diverse group required constant negotiation, psychological insight, and an acute awareness of the interplay between fear, loyalty, and opportunity. Luciano's genius was evident in his ability to manage these dynamics. He could reward initiative, neutralize dissent, and create a sense of collective purpose even among men who might otherwise have acted purely in self-interest. Betrayal was never hypothetical, it was omnipresent. In a world where reputation determined survival, even a single act of disloyalty could ripple outward, undermining authority and destabilizing operations. Luciano had to anticipate these moves, preempt threats, and act decisively to maintain control. Some rivals were eliminated swiftly and quietly, others were publicly neutralized to send a message. Each action was calculated to reinforce his authority while minimizing disruption to the network he had meticulously built. The psychological dimension of these maneuvers cannot be overstated. Fear, respect, and loyalty were tools that Luciano wielded with surgical precision, ensuring that his empire remained cohesive even under the constant threat of revolt. The tensions culminated in what would later be known as the Castellammarese War, a violent struggle for control of the Italian-American mafia in New York. Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano represented the entrenched old guard, while Luciano's faction, bolstered by strategic alliances with Jewish gangsters and forward-thinking Italian operators, sought to reshape the underworld according to his vision. The war was brutal, with high-profile murders, shifting alliances, and calculated acts of treachery. Luciano, ever the strategist, maneuvered with a combination of patience and ruthlessness, aligning with allies, exploiting rival weaknesses, and ultimately orchestrating the removal of his opponents. The Castellammarese War was not only a test of brute strength but also a psychological battle, one in which manipulation, perception, and foresight proved as decisive as firepower. Luciano's handling of the war demonstrated the full extent of his tactical genius. Unlike his predecessors, he did not rely solely on violence. He combined it with diplomacy, deception, and strategic timing. He cultivated informants, negotiated temporary truces, and orchestrated betrayals that struck at the heart of his rival's power. By balancing risk with reward, he was able to eliminate threats without destabilizing the broader network he had created. This approach reflected a profound understanding of both organizational psychology and human behavior. Men were motivated by fear, ambition, and the promise of gain, and a shrewd leader could manipulate all three simultaneously. The elimination of Masuria and later Maranzano marked a turning point in Luciano's career. With the old guard removed, he could impose his vision on the underworld, establishing the Commission, a governing body that coordinated operations across families, resolved disputes, and ensured that violence was controlled rather than chaotic. Yet even in victory, the dangers of betrayal and rivalry remained ever present. Former allies could become competitors, and ambitious subordinates always tested boundaries. Luciano's ability to maintain cohesion in this environment relied not only on the strategic innovations he had introduced but also on his mastery of psychological control, the careful orchestration of fear, loyalty, and respect to maintain order within a volatile ecosystem. It was also a period of profound personal risk. Luciano was acutely aware that in the criminal underworld, the line between power and vulnerability was razor-thin. Every alliance carried the potential for treachery, every victory could provoke retaliation, and every decision had both immediate and long-term consequences. His success depended on constant vigilance, keen observation, and the ability to anticipate moves several steps ahead. The empire he had built was as much a product of intellect as it was of force, and the stakes could not have been higher. Each day, he navigated a landscape in which a single mistake could undo years of meticulous planning, a testament to both his strategic genius and the precarious nature of underworld power. By the end of this period, Luciano had not only survived the most dangerous challenges of his career but had emerged as the undisputed architect of New York's criminal network. Allies were solidified, rivals eliminated, and the foundation of a modern, organized, and highly profitable underworld was firmly in place. Yet the lessons of betrayal, rivalry, and human ambition remained ever present, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed empire required constant management, psychological insight, and the willingness to act decisively. In navigating these perilous dynamics, Luciano demonstrated that power was not merely seized, it was cultivated, maintained, and protected through a delicate balance of strategy, influence, and ruthlessness. Even as Lucky Luciano consolidated his power following the bloody upheavals of the Castellammarese War, the underworld was far from stable. Beyond rivalries among gangsters, there existed an ever-present threat: the law. Federal authorities, city detectives, and the growing machinery of law enforcement had begun to focus on organized crime with increasing intensity. Prohibition had created massive profits for bootleggers, gamblers, and union racketeers, but it also drew scrutiny. Speakeasies were raided, shipments intercepted, and public outcry over crime and corruption intensified. For Luciano, this represented a new kind of challenge, one that could not be solved with brute force or clever alliances alone. To maintain his empire, he would need strategy, discretion, and the capacity to navigate both visible and invisible pressures simultaneously. The hidden war was fought not only with bullets but with strategy, influence, and perception. Luciano recognized that the appearance of power was as important as its exercise. Maintaining loyalty required projecting strength while controlling information, ensuring that both allies and enemies understood his capabilities without giving them leverage over him. He monitored law enforcement movements, cultivated informants, and used intermediaries to insulate himself from direct exposure. The psychological sophistication of this approach cannot be overstated. He understood that visibility was dangerous, but invisibility, when managed properly, could be a tool for dominance. By manipulating perception, he maintained an aura of untouchability even as authorities tightened the noose around organized crime. Internal conflicts added another layer of complexity to this hidden war. While Luciano had established the commission to manage disputes and enforce order among the families, human ambition and rivalry remained ever present. Ambitious lieutenants, jealous rivals, and disgruntled allies could all threaten the stability of his network. The delicate balance of power required constant attention. Luciano had to reward loyalty, deter betrayal, and maintain discipline without destabilizing the very structures he had built. Every decision carried both strategic and psychological weight, from choosing who would oversee a lucrative operation to deciding how to handle a perceived slight. His genius lay in managing these dynamics with precision, ensuring that the empire functioned smoothly even amid constant threats. One of the most significant elements of this period was Luciano's mastery of indirect influence. He rarely needed to confront problems personally. Instead, he relied on trusted lieutenants, intermediaries, and informants to execute his strategy. This allowed him to manage a sprawling empire without exposing himself unnecessarily to risk. It also created a network of accountability. Subordinates knew that their actions were monitored, that rewards and punishments were calibrated to maintain loyalty, and that failure or betrayal would have consequences not just for themselves but for their networks. In this way, Luciano extended his control psychologically as well as operationally, creating an invisible but pervasive presence that reinforced his authority. Government pressure intensified during this period, driven by high-profile arrests, sensational trials, and growing media attention. The public's fascination with organized crime created both risks and opportunities. For Luciano, the challenge was to navigate scrutiny without exposing the inner workings of his network. He leveraged legal loopholes, maintained layers of insulation between himself and operations, and cultivated relationships with sympathetic officials when possible. The ability to manipulate both the visible and hidden levers of power became a defining feature of his leadership, demonstrating that the empire he had built was as much about perception and intelligence as it was about money or muscle. Psychologically, this period demanded extraordinary resilience. The constant threats of arrest, betrayal, and assassination created an environment of extreme stress, where a single miscalculation could unravel years of planning. Luciano had to maintain composure, project confidence, and anticipate moves several steps ahead. His ability to navigate these pressures reflected both his intellectual acuity and his emotional discipline. By internalizing the lessons of the street and combining them with strategic foresight, he was able to maintain control over a highly volatile environment while continuing to expand his influence and operations. The hidden war also involved managing the balance between loyalty and fear. Men in Luciano's organization were constantly aware that their positions depended on both competence and obedience. Rewards were given for initiative and loyalty, while deviations were met with swift consequences. This system created a self-reinforcing dynamic. Subordinates internalized the rules, anticipated his expectations, and acted proactively to maintain favor. The psychological leverage this created allowed Luciano to operate an empire that was both disciplined and adaptive, capable of responding to threats without the need for constant direct intervention. Meanwhile, external threats remained formidable. Law enforcement agencies were increasingly coordinated, using intelligence, surveillance, and undercover operations to disrupt operations. Luciano responded with equal sophistication, developing counter-surveillance strategies, employing intermediaries, and creating layers of operational insulation. He understood that a direct confrontation with authorities was risky and that the most effective form of control often involved manipulation, misdirection, and strategic negotiation. By turning potential vulnerabilities into tools of influence, he demonstrated the depth of his strategic genius. Despite the danger and pressure, Luciano's empire continued to expand during this hidden war. Profitable enterprises in gambling, bootlegging, labor, and union racketeering grew in sophistication and scale. By integrating operations across families, ethnic groups, and industries, he created a network that was resilient, highly profitable, and difficult for both rivals and law enforcement to penetrate. The combination of strategic foresight, psychological mastery, and operational control allowed him to maintain dominance in a world defined by volatility, uncertainty, and constant threat. In essence, the hidden war represented the most complex phase of Luciano's rise. It was a conflict fought not only with weapons but with intelligence, psychology, and strategy. He had to balance competing interests, manage risk, and maintain authority across a vast and volatile empire. Every decision, every alliance, every enforcement action carried weight, and the stakes were nothing less than survival, dominance, and legacy. Through this crucible, Luciano demonstrated that power was not merely a function of violence, wealth, or alliances. It was a product of vision, intellect, and the ability to orchestrate human behavior with precision. By the end of this period, Luciano had emerged not only as the architect of a modern organized crime network but also as a master of invisible power. The hidden war had tested every dimension of his genius, strategic, operational, and psychological, and he had prevailed. His empire was no longer a collection of disparate operations. It was a cohesive, resilient, and adaptive system capable of withstanding external pressure and internal turbulence. The stage was set for the next chapter, the beginning of challenges that would test not just his strategic acumen but the very foundations of the empire he had built. Even the most carefully constructed empire has vulnerabilities, and for Lucky Luciano, those vulnerabilities began to surface in the late 1930s. Despite his mastery of alliances, omerta, and strategic foresight, the pressures of law enforcement, betrayal, and internal ambition began to converge in ways that would challenge the foundations of his empire. For years, Luciano had managed to insulate himself from direct exposure, using intermediaries, careful delegation, and psychological control to operate with near invisibility. But the law had evolved, public scrutiny had intensified, and rivals, both former allies and external adversaries, were waiting for an opportunity to exploit even the smallest misstep. The fall, when it began, would be both sudden and instructive, revealing the limits of power in a world defined by human ambition, law, and chance. The first cracks appeared in the form of legal investigations. Authorities had begun to focus more systematically on organized crime, employing wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations to collect evidence against key figures. Luciano, aware of the growing scrutiny, had relied on layers of intermediaries to distance himself from criminal activity, but these measures could not fully shield him. Evidence of involvement in gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering began to accumulate, forming the basis for charges that could not be ignored. For a man who had spent decades mastering the art of control, the realization that the law was now applying pressure directly was a profound shift, a psychological challenge as much as a strategic one. Betrayal, too, played a significant role in the unraveling of Luciano's position. In an underworld governed by ambition and opportunism, loyalty was always conditional. Former allies, sensing the pressure of law enforcement or motivated by personal gain, were willing to cooperate with authorities or provide incriminating testimony. Luciano's network, despite its discipline and cohesion, contained human vulnerabilities, men whose own survival instincts could supersede loyalty. The psychological dimension of betrayal struck at the core of the empire. It was not just financial or operational risk but a challenge to the authority and perception that had been carefully cultivated over years. The realization that trust could be compromised, even among those closest to him, highlighted the fragile nature of power built on human networks. The arrest itself marked the most dramatic turning point in Luciano's fall. Law enforcement moved decisively, seizing him on charges that were both severe and symbolic. The courtroom became a theater of both public spectacle and psychological contest, with Luciano at its center. For a man accustomed to orchestrating operations from the shadows, the exposure was a dramatic reversal. The media, sensing the story's magnitude, amplified the narrative, portraying him as both a mastermind and a menace, a figure whose influence extended far beyond the courtroom. The psychological impact of this visibility cannot be understated. The empire he had carefully constructed was suddenly vulnerable to public perception, legal scrutiny, and the ambitions of rivals. The trial itself was a complex interplay of strategy, reputation, and psychological maneuvering. Luciano's lawyers sought to insulate him from the full force of the charges, while prosecutors aimed to make an example of him, demonstrating that no man, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of the law. Witnesses, some motivated by justice, others by personal gain, were called to testify, their words carrying the potential to dismantle years of carefully orchestrated influence. Every statement, every reaction, and every nuance of behavior became a part of the broader narrative, a contest not only of facts but of perception. Luciano understood this, but the environment was fundamentally different from the controlled spaces of his empire. Here, authority was contested and the rules were dictated by courts, juries, and the public. Internally, the empire also felt the shockwaves. Lieutenants and subordinates, faced with the uncertainty of Luciano's fate, were forced to navigate a delicate balance of loyalty, self-preservation, and ambition. The psychological cohesion that had been maintained through fear, respect, and omerta was tested as never before. Some acted with discretion, maintaining the integrity of operations in his absence, while others sought advantage in the shifting power dynamics. This period revealed the inherent vulnerability of even the most disciplined organizations. Networks built on human loyalty, however well managed, could fracture under sustained external and internal pressure. The fall was further compounded by the personal toll. For Luciano, the experience of arrest, trial, and public scrutiny was a profound psychological shift. He had built his life around control, invisibility, and strategic foresight. Suddenly, he was subject to forces beyond his immediate command. The psychological dimension of this loss, of autonomy, perception, and dominance, was as significant as any operational or financial setback. It forced him to confront the reality that even the most brilliant strategist could be vulnerable to cumulative pressures. Law enforcement, betrayal, and circumstance could converge in ways that even foresight could not fully mitigate. Despite these challenges, Luciano demonstrated resilience and adaptability. He continued to influence operations from within confinement, issuing orders, maintaining alliances, and managing the perception of authority even under extreme pressure. His psychological acumen remained evident. He understood that the empire's survival depended not solely on his physical presence but on the perception of his control, the loyalty of key lieutenants, and the structured discipline of the network he had built. By leveraging these elements, he sought to mitigate the immediate impact of his arrest and preserve the broader integrity of his criminal enterprise. Yet the fall was irreversible in its immediate consequences. Conviction, imprisonment, and the loss of freedom marked the end of one phase of his empire. The psychological and operational vulnerabilities exposed by these events would shape his strategies in the years to come. For a man who had risen through ingenuity, organization, and psychological mastery, the experience was both humbling and instructive. It revealed the limits of control, the fragility of human loyalty, and the relentless pressure of forces beyond one's immediate sphere of influence. In the end, the fall of Luciano's empire was not a sudden collapse but a complex, multi-layered process. It was the result of accumulated pressure from law enforcement, betrayal from within, and the inherent challenges of maintaining loyalty and authority in a human network. It was a demonstration of the delicate balance between power and vulnerability, strategy and circumstance, perception and reality. Even in defeat, Luciano's capacity for adaptation, psychological insight, and strategic influence remained evident, setting the stage for the next phase of his story, the continuation of influence behind bars, and the ultimate test of resilience and legacy. Imprisonment was a challenge that could have broken a lesser man, but for Lucky Luciano, it became yet another stage on which to exercise power. Sentenced to decades behind bars, he faced the loss of freedom, influence, and autonomy, conditions that would destabilize most criminal networks. Yet Luciano approached incarceration not as an end, but as a strategic challenge. He understood that while physical confinement limited direct action, it could not entirely sever his influence over the sprawling empire he had constructed. His genius lay in recognizing that authority could transcend walls, that perception and psychological leverage could maintain control even in the absence of physical presence. From the moment of his imprisonment, Luciano set about asserting influence through intermediaries. Trusted lieutenants, messengers, and legal representatives became extensions of his will, transmitting instructions, resolving disputes, and ensuring that operations continued with minimal disruption. The empire he had built was structured precisely to function under such conditions. Hierarchies, rules of loyalty, and the code of omerta allowed him to maintain discipline and command respect from afar. Even behind bars, Luciano's presence was felt not as absence, but as a force whose authority was both visible and psychologically potent. Prison also presented an unexpected opportunity: influence over broader societal operations beyond the underworld. During this period, Luciano leveraged connections with government officials, exploiting the looming threat of World War II and the U.S. Navy's need for secure shipping and port operations. Through a combination of negotiation and strategic positioning, he offered assistance in protecting ports from sabotage in exchange for leniency and potential leverage. This maneuver demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for foresight, adaptability, and psychological manipulation. Luciano was not merely surviving. He was converting constraint into strategic advantage, transforming imprisonment into a stage for calculated influence. Maintaining control over the criminal network required psychological acuity of the highest order. Subordinates had to be motivated, disciplined, and loyal despite his absence. Luciano understood human behavior deeply. Men were guided by fear, opportunity, and respect. By calibrating rewards, demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty, and maintaining the perception of omnipresence, he ensured that the network remained cohesive. Even those outside the inner circle, who may never have seen him in person, were acutely aware that his influence permeated every decision. The empire continued to function with remarkable efficiency, a testament to both the systems he had established and the psychological leverage he maintained over his organization. Luciano's use of intermediaries also reflected his understanding of risk management. By delegating operational control while maintaining strategic oversight, he insulated himself from legal exposure and potential betrayal. Orders were communicated through trusted channels, financial flows were monitored, and disputes were mediated with precision. The network became a self-sustaining organism, capable of responding to external pressures without requiring direct intervention from its imprisoned leader. This capacity to manage complexity from confinement was unprecedented and reinforced his reputation as a mastermind whose authority transcended the physical limits of space and circumstance. The psychological dimension of his influence extended beyond subordinates to rivals and law enforcement alike. Even in prison, Luciano projected an aura of inevitability and control. Rivals understood that his empire was resilient, that alliances were enforced, and that betrayal carried consequences, regardless of incarceration. Law enforcement faced the challenge of dismantling operations that were meticulously insulated from direct contact with him, and the public perception of his power persisted, fueled by media coverage and the enduring notoriety of his name. This interplay of perception, fear, and respect reinforced his authority, demonstrating that influence was not merely exercised through physical presence but could be maintained through psychological strategy and organizational design. While managing external operations, Luciano also turned inward, consolidating influence within the prison itself. He established hierarchies among inmates, built alliances, and leveraged social dynamics to ensure both protection and operational advantage. Prison became a microcosm of his larger empire, a space in which he could exercise control, build loyalty, and demonstrate authority. Even confined, Luciano's strategic mind continued to orchestrate human behavior, using the principles that had guided his rise. Understanding motivation, manipulating perception, and leveraging networks of loyalty and influence. During this period, Luciano's strategic thinking began to anticipate the future beyond prison walls. He understood that the world was changing, that prohibition was ending, and that new opportunities would emerge for those able to adapt. By maintaining control over operations, cultivating political and law enforcement connections, and ensuring the loyalty of his network, he positioned himself to resume influence once released. The psychological resilience required to plan beyond immediate adversity, to envision opportunities within constraint, was a hallmark of his genius. Even incarceration could not diminish his capacity for foresight, calculation, and strategic orchestration. Perhaps most remarkably, Luciano's time in prison reinforced the enduring power of his organizational philosophy. Systems, hierarchy, and psychological control proved resilient even under extreme pressure. The very structure of the empire he had built, its hierarchies, rules of loyalty, and integration of diverse enterprises, enabled continuity despite the loss of physical freedom. This period demonstrated that the foundations of power were not merely personal charisma or immediate force, but systems of influence, discipline, and foresight that could endure even in the face of adversity. Ultimately, power behind bars was not an oxymoron for Luciano. It was a testament to the genius with which he had conceived and structured his empire. He had created an organization capable of operating autonomously, yet responsive to his guidance. Disciplined, yet adaptable, loyal, yet enforced by both principle and consequence. Even as authorities sought to contain him and rivals waited for weakness, Luciano's influence remained pervasive, proving that leadership, strategy, and psychological insight could transcend physical confinement. In this way, imprisonment became less a downfall and more a stage for demonstrating the enduring strength of vision, organization, and mastery of human behavior. By the time Lucky Luciano was released from prison, the world he had once dominated had changed dramatically. Exile to Italy was both a physical displacement and a profound confrontation with the limits of power. Stripped of the streets, allies, and operations that had defined his empire, he was forced to navigate an unfamiliar environment where influence was no longer exercised through direct control but through careful strategy, psychological leverage and long-distance negotiation. Even in exile, Luciano understood that power was not only about proximity, it was about perception, relationships, and the subtle orchestration of loyalty and fear. Despite the constraints of deportation, Luciano continued to exert influence over the criminal networks he had built. Trusted lieutenants and intermediaries carried his directives, arbitrated disputes, and maintained the flow of operations in New York and beyond. He cultivated alliances cautiously, aware that any misstep in a foreign environment could undermine his authority. In this way, exile became less a limitation than a new arena for demonstrating strategic genius. Luciano's ability to manage perception, maintain loyalty, and influence behavior from afar was a testament to his mastery of psychological control and organizational foresight. Exile also offered a period of reflection and philosophical insight. Luciano confronted the duality of his life: brilliance intertwined with ruthlessness, ambition coupled with moral compromise, and vision shaped by both opportunity and violence. He recognized the human cost of his rise, the betrayals, the casualties, and the networks of fear and loyalty that had sustained his empire. This period allowed him to contemplate the broader lessons of power, influence, and legacy, understanding that the strategies he had perfected could endure beyond his physical presence, shaping both the underworld and perceptions of leadership for generations. While removed from direct operations, Luciano's legacy continued to grow. His innovations, the commission, organized hierarchies, and integrated criminal enterprises, remained in effect, demonstrating the resilience of the systems he had built. Exile transformed him from an active ruler into a strategist and observer, highlighting the enduring reach of intellect, foresight, and psychological mastery, even in the face of constraint and vulnerability. Ultimately, Luciano's exile was a period of adaptation, influence, and reflection. Though physically distant from the empire he had created, he continued to shape its operations and legacy, proving that true power extends beyond control of territory. It resides in the mind, in relationships, and in the careful orchestration of human behavior. As Lucky Luciano's life drew to a close, the full arc of his rise, empire, and exile comes into sharp focus, not just as a tale of crime, but as a study of ambition, strategy, and the psychology of power. From the chaotic streets of New York to the meticulously organized network he built, Luciano transformed the underworld with unprecedented innovation, creating the commission, coordinating families, and integrating criminal enterprises with the precision of a master strategist. His genius lay not only in operational control but in psychological insight, managing loyalty, fear, and perception to maintain authority even from prison or exile. Yet Luciano's story is defined by duality. He was brilliant and ruthless, visionary and morally compromised. His empire brought wealth and order to some, fear and violence to others. The myth of an untouchable mastermind often overshadows the human reality: a man constrained by law, betrayal, and circumstance, navigating the limits of power with intelligence and adaptability. Exile transformed his influence into a subtler, more psychological force, demonstrating that authority extends beyond physical presence, rooted in relationships, perception, and foresight. Luciano's legacy reshaped organized crime, but it also offers broader lessons. Power is ephemeral, influence is complex, and the human mind, capable of extraordinary calculation, is always subject to risk, consequence, and morality. He remains both a cautionary tale and a study in strategy, leadership, and human behavior, a figure whose life reflects the tension between ambition and limitation, myth and reality. In the end, Lucky Luciano is remembered not merely as a criminal, but as a strategist of unparalleled skill, a man whose influence, lessons, and psychological mastery continue to resonate long after his death.